So I'm Anne Morris. I was actually born Catherine Ann Morris because in our generation, for some amazing reason, children were always named after their parents and called by a different name. I was born in a place called Uralla in New South Wales, in a cottage hospital which was established during the war because people didn't have petrol to go to the big hospitals. So my family were a farming community, sheep farming community in the New England tablelands in New South Wales. My father was probably a fourth generation sheep farmer. My mother came from Newcastle, where her family had been for quite a long time. Mum and Dad met during the war and married. I think in lots of ways, the men who came back from the Second World War came back just as damaged as we know the people from the Vietnam War were, and we went on to what was called a soldier settlement block, which the government carved up large tracts of land and gave them to soldiers who came back from the war, but they were actually never large enough for people to make a living out of, so they set all these men up to complete failure. And as a result, I grew up believing that all fathers were alcoholics, and that all mothers kept the world going. And I sort of reflect on that now and see that the way my dad was as we grew up as very much part of that post-traumatic stress syndrome, which wasn't identified that far back. So I went to a one-teacher school. We used to ride bicycles or horses to meet the bus. I grew up in a home with no electricity till I was 15, and it was a pretty tough life probably in lots of ways, but everybody was leading the same sort of life, so we didn't know that. Looking back, we were extremely poor. I said to my mother once, "You must have just loved that dress, Mum, you've got it on in every picture." She said it was the only dress I owned. I didn't have a new dress for 16 years. And I think in this day and age that's just inconceivable to us. We just can't imagine living at that style. But we never felt that we were poor or deprived because nobody else was really all that much better off. So off I went to my one-teacher school where we had an appalling sadistic teacher. So from the day I started school at age 4 years and 6 months till the day I finished at that school, I had 6 cuts of the cane every day because he liked giving kids 6 cuts of the cane. That was his operation method. So when I hear people saying we need to bring back the cane, I'm not totally convinced about that because it was hugely destructive to me as a person. And he used to say every day, "You're the stupidest girl I've ever taught and you'll never make anything of yourself." Then when Mum and Dad sent me off to boarding school, I went with that self-belief that I just was filling in time. I didn't know really what for. And it took me a long, long time to overcome that. Probably into my 40s when I started to believe that yes, I actually was an intelligent person and I was a very capable person. I went to boarding school for 5 years in a Catholic system, which wasn't always the most nurturing, I have to say. Then I went to Teachers College in Newcastle for 2 years and went off then teaching in Sydney, to the western suburbs of Sydney. And western suburbs of Sydney were a pretty difficult area to teach in. I had 56 grade 4s, which was the normal class size then. And of that group of grade 4s, there were sort of about 10, 13 of them had already been through juvenile court. And I was twice knocked out by a brick that a child hit me over the head with while I was writing on the blackboard in my first year of teaching. So when I hear teachers say these days, "Oh, the kids are just uncontrollable," I think never been any different. Depends on where you grew up and where you're taught in lots of ways. So I then went overseas to do the backpacking around Europe in the late 1960s. Met my husband over there. Came back to Australia. He was a geologist working at Mount Isa Mines. He was actually English, but he'd already immigrated to Australia. We got married and we lived in Mount Isa for 14, 15 years. that was a really, there was a couple of things. When I came back to Australia, it's really interesting when you live in Australia, and at that stage people didn't travel quite so much. And so you don't realise that you've got an Australian accent when you first go overseas. So we all went by boat because the airfares were hugely expensive. A one-way ticket to London in 1968 was $2,500, and as a teacher I was earning $2,500 a year. So if we take that through to the equivalent now, it's probably the equivalent of about $55,000. So when people talk about, oh, I'm all squashed up in economy, you're flying because you are all squashed up in economy. I mean, people just couldn't travel. So boat travel was cheaper, and I landed in London, and I was already going to go into this flat with a whole lot of people who had connections with people I knew in Sydney. And I walked into a shop to buy some basic food. And I said to the man, I'll have a pound of cheese, please. And he said, that'd be Australian cheese, would it, love? And I was just like, oh my God, that was all I said. And our accent was that strong. And I hadn't realised that. And I think that's a thing that historically, it's interesting about that development of accents, isn't it? If we all came out from usually a common UK background, certainly in the early days, where do the accents develop and grow from? How do they become what they are? Anyhow, that was just an interesting thing, and you then forget about it. And then I flew back into Darwin when I came back from the UK after my year over there, and they used to have ground hostesses at all international airports who sort of walked around looking beautiful and saying nice things. And this girl came up to us, and I mean, she looked fabulous, and she said, so are you the one that needs to go to the hotel tonight, love, are you? I was like, oh my God, you know, because it was just, having been with the British accent for all that time, you just didn't realise. So then we were in Mount Isa, we got married and lived in Mount Isa. My first introduction to Queensland politics was when Russ Hinds, do you remember Big Russ? Minister for Everything? Came to an Institute of Mining and Metallurgy dinner. We had an annual dinner which was a very prestigious affair. And I hadn't lived in Queensland at all. I wasn't used to sort of, and particularly probably not to North Queensland. And Big Russ got up and said, right, thanks for asking me. I know yous all think you're going to get some money out of me because you've invited me to this dinner. Well, you can all get stuffed, you bastards, because we're not giving you anything. We're keeping it down on the Gold Coast where I lived. I was like, oh my God, this is telling it how it really was, wasn't it? And after I'd lived in Queensland for a while, I realised that that was exactly what happened in actual fact. It was really quite corrupt and amazing. I was just stunned at the level of blatant corruption that existed at that stage and the mismanagement of politics in Queensland. So I then had 3 children, Jenny, Wendy and Jeffrey. After I'd had Jenny, I was approached by the Catholic education system to go back to teaching. I had been working at the mines for a while, and then my husband was an executive at Mount Isa Mines, and wives weren't allowed to work. Women weren't allowed to work either at the mines or in lots of other jobs in those days, and it was when teachers had to resign if they were married. You weren't allowed to stay on as permanent staff, women teachers. And so the Catholic system then had this declaration put onto them by Education in Queensland to say that they had to have qualified teachers. And they hadn't had qualified teachers up until then. If you cooked, you taught. If you drew, you taught. So they needed an art teacher. And I said, I can't teach art. Like, if I draw an animal, I have to label it if it's got 4 legs, cow, horse, dog, whatever it happens to be. Oh, that's all right, we just need someone to stand in front of the class. So I went into that system, and what I quickly discovered was that there was a huge population of Indigenous children who came down from the missions, and they boarded in Mount Isa, and they were just totally displaced. like they weren't fitting into the system, and there was no method to try and fit them into the system. They needed an education, so we'll plonk them from Arakoon down into Mount Isa for a couple of years and then sort of send them back. But I then became really quite interested in Indigenous culture, and it's become, you know, quite a strong interest of mine. And so I realised that lots of those kids actually had quite a lot of artistic ability, and I then tapped into them, and I got them to teach me how they did their art, their dot painting and their bark art, and how they got their colours, and we'd go out on expeditions getting the rocks that they used to grind down for colours and things. And that was sort of a whole new world to me, so I found that fascinating. And I then really went into an Indigenous integration sort of a role in the school, and I loved that, and I just found it was a whole pool of talent and belief and culture that we had just totally ignored. We'd never done Aboriginal history at school. We didn't actually realise there was an Aboriginal history. We only ever did European history, UK history, European history. And so that sort of sparked a belief in me that we needed to do something else. And I then wrote a curriculum because I was aware that a lot of the kids would go back to the missions and they wouldn't have any gainful employment. I wrote a curriculum for how to remain gainfully unemployed, and I taught them budgeting, and I taught them cooking, and I taught them hobbies that might be able to generate some sort of income, and I encouraged them to actually sort of develop their artistic talents and those cultural things that were important to them. So I did that for 10 years, I suppose. I was really interested that we were in Mount Isa I was in Mount Isa from 1970 to 1982, and there was still huge prejudice against Aboriginal people, and I, in some ways, I guess, wasn't so aware of it, and because I'd latched into this sort of Aboriginality. But my daughter Jenny went to school for 5 years with Debbie Mailman, the actress, and when she came here as the lead role in The Taming of the Shrew with an Arts Council production, I sent a note saying, I don't know whether you remember me, but I'm Jenny's mum, Jenny Morris's mum, and you know, you were at school with her. I'd love to have a bit of a catch-up if you've got time. And my phone rang within about 2 minutes. And she said, yes, Mrs Morris, I'm coming round. And I said, I just wasn't even sure, because it's a long time ago, you know, by then. And she said, as if I'm going to forget, you were the only white family who ever asked me to birthday parties. And I said, what do you mean? And she said, well, you know, they used to have whole class birthday parties without me because I was the black girl. And I hadn't been aware of that. I guess because I wasn't so tuned in even at that stage to that sort of level of prejudice, I was stunned. She said, everybody would go to the birthday party, but you used to have men not just for parties, but to play one-to-one. And so that was really powerful for me, that something that you'd done, and we do this all our lives, don't we, has such a huge influence and an image thing in your life. You know, this was a time when. And those moments, I think, we aren't even conscious of them when they happen. It's only in hindsight when we look back or somebody talks to us about them that becomes the case. And so I guess really by that stage I'd become a cultural seeker, and I was a thinker probably once more, you know, by the time I'd got into my 30s and I'd started to really think and question a whole lot of systems and things, that took me in a different path in lots of ways. And I know whilst we were in Mount Isa, I was by default, I think, elected as president of the Executive Wives Club, which was a very prestigious role. And once I'd been there for 6 months, I realised that it was it was a dated and useless thing, because by that stage women had started to work and had started to make lives for themselves, and they weren't just expected to sit at home drinking whiskey and playing bridge. And I moved a motion that the club be closed down. And they're going, no, we've got to have this to encourage good quality professional staff. Well, they didn't, because within 6 months, I then resigned because I said I really felt that I was president of an organisation that wasn't relevant anymore. Within 6 months it collapsed anyhow. And I think that was what we were talking about earlier and saying some people just can't do change. They have to cling to the known. And I have to say that despite my father being a very difficult man and an alcoholic, we always knew we were very loved, and Mum and Dad both always encouraged us to do the best we could and to take on new challenges. And I think when I look at my 5 siblings now, we were all allowed to develop and be our own person, which in some ways even then was a bit different because kids were expected to sort of fit into a mould, you know, and the girls will do this and the boys will do that, and that's how it was. So I had that background of some level of security. I mean, it was hugely eroded by the teacher at the school, but gradually I guess his influence waned and I sort of went on from there. When we were in Mount Isa, we ended up with a child who had a great deal of illness, and it became a huge trauma. And I laugh in a way when I hear people now saying, oh, people on Manus Island, and I have a great sympathy. I don't think we should have people on Manus Island, but it annoys me sometimes when they say, oh, and it was 3 days before they could get medical help. Well, we've got people in the country areas of Queensland and it's 3 days before they get medical help. We don't make a huge fuss about them. And I think we've got to sort of look still. I believe the greatest discrimination in Queensland is geographic discrimination, and that only gets worse as time goes on, and we become so southeast corner centric that the rest of the state will eventually just fall to pieces unless we do something serious about it. So we were having to go constantly. I was having to travel to either Brisbane or to Townsville every 3 weeks. And, you know, in the end, I just couldn't do it. I mean, I'd drive across to Townsville, 1,200 kilometres on a Monday, and I'd see the doctor on a Tuesday, and then I'd drive back 1,200 kilometres on a Wednesday, and I had to do that every 3 weeks. And in the end, you just can't do it anymore. It's too demanding and too awful. And so we decided we'd move close to the coast. We moved to Charters Towers, and we had a couple of years in Charters Towers. Funny place, Charters Towers. I mean, in lots of ways, quite similar to sort of this area here, where there's a lot of history and a lot of tradition, and where people had lived generationally. And it was interesting for me then to come from Charters Towers into Maryborough, because I saw that there was a lot of common characteristics where, because generational people stayed in Maryborough and in Charters Towers, they often had no concept of assimilating newcomers into their community, because they didn't need to. They knew their families were here, their friends were here, they'd gone to school with them. And so I found, because we were only 2 years in Charters Towers, never really cracked Charters Towers, I have to say, and it was probably the one place I've ever lived where I wasn't completely happy. I mean, I loved what I did there. I went to teach there at All Souls and St Gabriel's, which was a Anglican boarding school, and I took on the role there that I'd had at San Jose, which was nurturing the mission kids and lots of kids from New Guinea. And even though I was officially on the teaching staff, really I just did mostly looking after them and nurturing them and sort of making sure that they were able to cope with the cultural changes and with the homesickness. They used to send little kids of 7 and 8 from New Guinea, and they didn't see their parents from one year to the next. I mean, it was just cruel. And I mean, I know they've always done it in England, you know, stiff British thing, and put the kids into boarding school to make men of them. Well, I just saw it as being just terrible, terrible. You know, children of 7 and 8 torn away from their parents and sent to boarding school. And because it was so expensive to travel, they couldn't go home. So they'd go home for Christmas. Once a year, they'd see their parents for Christmas. And, you know, if you think about 7-year-olds around us today, it's just a very traumatic thing for them. So I did a lot of work with those kids. They used to come home to my place for the weekend, hordes of them. We'd feed them because they always never had enough food at boarding school. And it was a sort of interesting time, but very closed society at Charters Towers. So then my husband had a midlife crisis and decided he wanted to be a shopkeeper because his uncle had had a shop in England where they had jars of sweets, and he thought that was a really nice thing to do. So off we went to a place called Cumbia, which is out the other side of Kingaroy. And we bought a little general store in Cumbia, and we were the store. You know, we had petrol and we had takeaway food and we had the news agency and we had the grocery store. It was all rolled into one little place. And we did that for 2 years. And that was a very interesting experience as well, because I thought I'd seen all aspects of society, but when you're the only shop in a town, you suddenly do see all aspects of society. And so being a shopkeeper for 2 years was very interesting experience, and seeing how people operated. And so, you know, you'd have this little book where they put, that was the tick book, you know, that they'd come in and book up. And so they'd all come in on payday and they'd pay their fortnightly bill, and they'd order hamburgers and chips and soft drinks for dinner, and they'd do that on sort of Friday, and then they'd do it on Saturday, and then by Sunday they were back into the tick book because they'd used up all their money. I'd never sort of experienced that lifestyle, and I found that quite fascinating. And the people that we bought it from said, oh, you know, you need to be aware of this family. They are probably the only people we've got who don't necessarily pay their bill. And what I do is, says the man, when they come and buy 100 grams of Devon, does Devon exist anymore? Devon sausage, Devon sliced Devon sausage. I give them 95 and I take 5 cents off their bill each time, so that, you know, I'm sort of catching up with them. So if they have a kilo of tomatoes, I just give them 900 grams of tomatoes and put that against their bill, you know. So he kept a double column bill. So I decided, all right, if that's what he'd operated as a system, I could do the same. So this time, you know, I mean, probably for 4 months they didn't pay their bill, and I'd sort of got the little tick box thing was sort of running, you know, not too badly. And then they came in this day and they had a win on the races or something and paid the whole bill off. So then I had to start adding all that money back into their things, because I felt that I'd sort of got their $19.50 that they owed, and they didn't owe it anymore because they'd paid it. So that was sort of, you know, those sorts of things were quite funny in the shop. And it was a rich community. Out at Kingaroy, deep Lutheran tradition, and everybody went to church. In the last part of the time at Cumbia, I said to Dave, I can't do this anymore. We were working extraordinary hours for very little return, and I was just getting quite stressed about it. And I felt I didn't have enough time with my children, and we didn't have enough family time. And small business owners, to a large extent, are like that, I think, certainly across Australia. And so I started looking at job ads, and I saw this job ad for people to become personal development consultants with the Department of Education in Queensland. And I thought, oh, that sounds like me, I'll apply for that. And I did, and after extensive interviewing processes, I think I had a 5-hour interview with 8 people in the first interview, and then I had another 3-hour interview with 6 people. And what they were going to do in Queensland was they were going to run what were called personal development programs for teenagers and their families in after-school hours. And there was a group of 10 of us selected across the whole of Queensland to run the programs, and there were 3 places that were going to be trials, and Wide Bay was one of them. And so, having been appointed into that, suddenly we had to move because it was based here in Maryborough. We'd never been to Maryborough, so Dave and I got some people to come in and run the shop for 3 days, and we raced across here and we ran around and looked at 6 houses and said, we'll have that one that's empty, thank you very much, and raced back and sold the business. Then I had to go to Brisbane for 6 months to train up in what they wanted done, and this was in the era of Joe, and it was quite politically controversial that they were going to do this, but there was such a problem with a whole lot of personal development issues in our society that somebody with a bit of vision saw that had to happen. So we came to Maryborough to live, and my husband became a Mr. Mum. Very suspicious in Maryborough at that stage, I have to say. We're talking 37 years ago. And it was very interesting to me that there were families which would not let their children come to play at our house because there's something very strange in that family. The mother goes out and goes away to work and the father stays home with the kids. Why are they doing that? I mean, now it's not even an issue. People just do it all the time. But I have to say that was like, whoa. And when Dave volunteered to do tuck shop and do reading in classrooms, oh, well, men don't do that, do they? Well, I'm the mother now, he says. My wife's out earning the money, so I need to be doing it. Well, that was like, and I don't know that that was just Maryborough. I think that was generally the case, that men weren't sort of seen to be competent at running households. My children do say that I have quite a rose-coloured vision of how well he did it. I thought they managed. They were still alive every week when I got back, so I had to be okay. So I actually used to leave home on a Monday morning and not get back until a Friday afternoon. And what we did was we ran interactive family sessions for families who had children in grade 8, 9 and 10 in high schools. And so we'd go into a community. It was very controversial because it included sexuality teaching, and that was really one of the reasons it was started, because we had such a massive rate of deaths from abortion in this state and sexually transmitted diseases, way, way above any other state in Queensland, in Australia at that stage. And there was felt to be a need to do some sexuality education in with, you know, communication, self-esteem, relationships, all of the things that make up for the whole of personal development. And it was a very interesting job. We used to probably have to go down to Brisbane once a month and answer 16 ministerial complaints that had been written to the minister about what we were doing, and we were encouraging sexual promiscuity by talking about these things. But in actual fact, it was probably one of the most exciting and successful things that Education Queensland has ever done, other than their music program, which is just way out there. So we used to go, for instance, if we were working in Maryborough, we'd go into the schools and we'd talk to the kids. We'd have public meetings with parents to talk about what we were going to do. And then for 4 weeks in a row, for 3 hours a night, so we'd have grade 8s, grade 9s and grades 10, the parents and the kids came in and we did 2 to 3 hour interactive sessions about the particular topic that we were doing. How do you communicate? You know, how do you stop the breakdown in communication that often happens at this age? You know, what do we need to know about sexuality? And of course, because the sexuality part was the most controversial part, it was always the bit that was focused on. It was never focused on, oh, suddenly we can really talk well to our children. We've discovered that this is what was blocking it. And I remember one particularly exciting day when we went to Bundaberg, because we did right up to Rosedale, out to Kingaroy and down to Noosa. That was our area. And it was a hugely demanding job, I have to say. We travelled about 120,000 k's a year on the road doing the schools. We used to work daytimes in the schools and night times with the parents. But we went to Bundaberg for the first time, and the Bundaberg News Mail had across the front page, "Flying Sex Squad Hits Town." It's really hard to be taken seriously if you've got a headline like that. Once more, it was off to the minister to be answering about why such a thing would be presented. But, I mean, there was no way you could disguise the fact we were doing sexuality. We felt we needed to do sexuality. We needed to address the issues that grade 8s and 9s and 10s were facing, which lots of times their parents felt unable or inadequate to address. And my mother was mortified when I went into this job because it was, you know, very big press and there was a lot of controversy about it. She said, I'm really embarrassed to tell my friends that you're part of what's happening there. And I said, well, why are you? And she said, well, you know, do you need to talk about that sex stuff? And I said, well, quite frankly, yes, given the amount of information you gave me as I was growing up. And she said, I told you everything I knew. And I said, well, it wasn't enough. Let me tell you, it wasn't enough. So I did that for the 6 years that the program lasted. In the meantime, my kids had sort of slotted into the Maryborough way of life and they'd gone to Maryborough High and Central. And Dave had done his job as a Mr. Mum, and he did a degree while he was at home, as women often do, and as I did further down the track, another degree. And we sort of settled into Maryborough, and we'd made a commitment to come to Maryborough until the kids finished high school, because I think it's critical that kids can start their high school and finish it in one lump if that's possible, because it is a really difficult time. And I saw in Maryborough some great strengths and some great weaknesses. The huge strength was that the Maryborough community, in lots of ways, has a commitment to its people and its community that's possibly almost unique because of the generational embedding here. So when one of the Suveless boys, I can't remember whether it was at a car accident, I think, and he was really badly injured, and they said that he'd never be able to move or walk or anything else again. He'd be really bad quadriplegic. But there was a doctor in Brisbane who said, you know, they've got this new therapy where if he's massaged for 16 hours a day in a certain way, he may in actual fact be able to regain some sort of movement. And they put it into the Chronicle, who's prepared to come along and learn how to do this massage and do 2 hours a week? And like there was 2,500 people volunteered. And that to me was just amazing. That in this small community there were that many people who wanted one of their children to be given the optimal opportunity. And of course it worked. He did in actual fact end up regaining a level of mobility that he probably would never have had previously. He would have just laid in bed and died. And that was probably my first experience of the Maryborough community. But I have seen that repeated so often, that when there's a moment of need from a member of the community, this is a community that really gets in and does. And I think that's one of the very, very powerful things about Maryborough. And it's balanced out by the fact that because of that deep hereditary and constant staying in the community, oftentimes people don't move forward with their perspectives and perceptions of what needs to make a community survive in the 21st century. And I think those two things, they're just part of the same equation in lots of ways. And I think when I decided to run for council, I had so many people came to see me and say, well, there's no point, Anne. Why is there no point? Well, you weren't born here. Well, surely not everybody who's ever been on council was born here. Oh, I think you'll find they were. And I really looked at it then and thought, oh, is that why we've been left behind? Because people have not been exposed to other influences, and we do need to change and be exposed to other influences if we're going to be part of a moving world. And what I found, it was true. There was only ever one person who hadn't been born in Maryborough who'd been on council at that stage. And so that was really a bit of a frightening scenario, I have to say. But I think because I'd worked, by that stage I'd gone out of the personal development and I was doing completely different things. So I'd worked across a whole lot of schools and a whole lot of community areas. And so I really had quite a high profile at that stage. And I got onto council amazing everybody, including myself and my husband, who'd said, oh, I'll let Mum run for council. I'm not going to object to it now because she's not going to get in. We know that people in Maryborough are not going to elect somebody. And so he was quite horrified then when I got in, because it meant he had to go to public functions all the time. It wasn't his thing. I saw that Maryborough was being left behind, and I was fairly sure it was because the people who were running the city didn't have a vision for a future. They were happy with the status quo. You know, this is how it's always been, this is how it'll always be. And you just can't do that, because if you're not moving forward, you're going backwards. And I very much knew that. So by that stage, my eldest child had finished school, and all my 3 children were earning money. And amazingly, we suddenly had money in the bank. Because you go through educating your 3 children, and you go through, you know, this, we're earning this much money, we're earning this much money, and we're okay. And then suddenly our education costs are this much and this much, and sort of for a while there, you've got no money. And you have, like, you're living from hand to mouth while you educate your children. And then all 3 of my children started work in the same year. So Jeffrey went off to do an apprenticeship, Wendy went off to work in Brisbane, and Jenny finished her 4-year degree. And we weren't paying for any children, and we went, oh my God, we're free, we're free. And so we both resigned. He was working at Mount Isa commuting, fly in, fly out at that stage. We both resigned our permanent jobs and set up a consultancy, a family consultancy, and I did mine in personal development and he did his in geology, and so we entered this next wonderful 8 years of our lives, where for 8 years we worked for 9 months really hard and travelled for 3 months the rest of the time, and that was just fabulous and exposed me to vast intercultural and other sorts of experiences. This is how people are doing it here, and this is how people are doing it there. And, you know, a school we saw in the Northern Territory where the whole school had been built without walls because that's what the community wanted. And it was so successful because the Aboriginal people don't like being hemmed in lots of times, especially if they're coming from, you know, the remote communities. So the whole school just had roofs and pillars. And I was fascinated that that community had listened enough to their people to actually do that. So lots of things we saw and did. In the meantime, I'd been asked by Maryborough High to come in and set up what's now known as special support units in schools. But because of the background that I had, I said I wouldn't do it if it was just going to support children who had learning disabilities, because I believe they were a very small percentage of the needs of teenagers. And they said, well, you know, we've never had it before and there's only one in Queensland, so you can do what you like with it if you like. So I did that. I went into Maryborough High and set up what we called the Maryborough Support Unit. Call it something else, can't remember now. And I set up in a group for gifted and talented children, and I set up a group for children who came from alcoholic abuse, so an Alateen group, victims of domestic violence, children who had physical disabilities, obviously children who had learning disabilities. So we did the whole spectrum of needs of child, because at some stage in our lives we all have needs over and above the rest of the population, or over and above the rest of our lives. And so I was very proud, I have to say. That was obviously the second thing I'd sort of started as a new thing, following on from the personal development program. And the unit just hummed along because I used community people. So the Alateen people used to come in and run a group, and kids then who'd been really isolated and hadn't been able to cope because they were dealing with alcoholism at home was suddenly in a group that was being supported, and it gave them an ability to perform at a different level. And the gifted and talented kids, who to a certain extent had always been sort of, oh, well, they're the strange kids, you know, we don't want them interfering with our system, they know too much, put them into a group. And I became very involved with a thing called Tournament of Minds, which was a thinking competition for grade 8s, 9s and 10s. And I had fun because all the really batty, crazy kids were attracted to Tournament of Minds, and I loved those kids. Always really liked the odd kids. And I used to have just the best time with them. We'd sort of train up for the state competition, and we won states a number of times, went off and did nationals, and was able to expose a lot of kids to outside experiences. And I think that was a big thing for me, because when my eldest daughter was in year 10, they had a fantastic English teacher who encouraged them to enter this newspaper competition and write a newspaper, and it was sort of being run by Australian Press or something. And they won the Queensland section, and there were 7 in the group, and only 3 of them would their parents give permission to take the prize, which was a trip to Brisbane, Sydney and Canberra to see how newspapers were put together and how journalists work. And Jenny came home to me and she said, "Mum, 4 of the kids, their parents won't let them go." And I said, "What do you mean?" And they say, "Oh, they're not letting their kids go off to the city and be exposed to all that stuff." Like, these were kids who were 15, in 2 years going to be finished school. They were obviously highly intelligent children and capable that they could do this, and 4 out of the 7 of them weren't allowed to go. And I found that really frightening. And I felt I needed to a certain extent to challenge that mentality as much as I could, because I think that's a very limiting factor in your whole community, if that's the way people are thinking, that you know, we don't want to be exposed to this. And you know, I talk to people who'd say, "Oh, I've never been past Tyro." Never been past Tyro, for heaven's sake. And it was just really interesting to me. And I remember when we took, because my husband's English, we took the kids back to England a couple of years after we'd been here. And Jenny came home and said, "Oh, everybody's saying that's really strange, that we're all going back to England." And I said, "Why? Why is it really strange?" "Well, you know, people don't go to England, do they?" And, you know, I think we don't have that so much anymore. Maryborough kids go off and they do things all over the place. But I still think that there's quite a bit of that underlying in a lot of our entrenched families, that there is a fear of the unknown, I guess. And it's probably true of all communities, really, but because you're in this community, that's what you see. With my consultancy then, one of the things I realised was that kids were not being prepared adequately for the workforce, and that was partly because we'd been left behind technologically. And so the teachers at the school, who'd never done anything but teaching, and I'm a teacher by profession, I guess, and I'll say this without any shame at all, that teachers are very narrow-minded people as a race, sadly, and it's the reason that lots of kids, yes, they are, and more so, they marry teachers, they go on holidays with teachers, they spend all their social time with teachers, they never often adequately integrate into the community. If you look at service clubs in town, you will very rarely find a teacher in any of them. They just have this big vision, and I was wanting to challenge that, because I saw that our kids weren't being prepared adequately to join today's workforce. So I started a school industry links program called the Maryborough School Industry Placement Program. And I went round and personally registered 472 businesses in town who were prepared to take students for work placements in a meaningful way. And I set up a program to train the kids to go into that. So I set up a school to work program where kids learnt how to do interview skills, how to know what they needed to do in a workplace, you know, how you speak to your boss, how you don't speak to your boss, all of the things, basic work skills that kids needed. And that program just took off and went really, really well, I have to say. And within a couple of years we started doing school-based apprenticeships, which were in their infancy, and I thought, oh, this is a great thing. Kids can do part of their apprenticeship and part of their schooling simultaneously. And within 4 years I had about 100 kids who were doing apprenticeships simultaneously with their senior education. And I'd made teachers go out. So for instance, they would say if a kid was really struggling at school and not able to cope academically, I'll go out to Hines. You know, there's always job for useless people out at Hine Timber. And I'd been to Hine Timber to register, and I knew it was like this state-of-the-art facility. At Hine Timber, nobody touches a tree from the moment they go out in the forest and mark it to when it's shrink wrapped, ready to go off to the purchaser. It's all done by computers and everything. Teachers had no idea. And so they were advising kids. And I remember the career advisor saying to this girl, she wanted to do natural therapies. Oh, look, darling, that's not a real job, you know. That's just a hobby. You need to get a real job. You can't do natural therapies. So trying to move people forward in that sort of area was really important to me. I felt that kids of Maryborough, unless they were exposed to that, and I wanted to stop kids from going to bush camps to going to city camps. Because our kids, lots of them have a fairly good idea on the bush, but sit them in Brisbane or Sydney or wherever, and I had already analysed that about 30% of the kids who went to uni didn't finish their first semester, not because they couldn't cope academically, but because they didn't know how to live in a city. And I think that was a great tragedy, because we were losing kids who had the potential to do great things because they hadn't been adequately prepared for a different lifestyle. And so I did a whole lot of that and set that program up. And this is where I once more ran into the Indigenous prejudice. We had a girl who was in Year 12. She was a prefect, she was a high achiever, excellent at sport, did well academically. I sent her out to do an interview. Back she came. How'd it go? Not sure. Employer rings me the next day and says, I don't think that child's really suitable for us. And so then I sent her somewhere else, and they rang to say she wasn't really suitable for them. And then that happened a third time, and I'd never had this, because I was really trying always to match up what I thought the child's skill set was to the employer. So I called her in and said, what are you doing at these interviews that this is happening? And she said, oh, come on, miss, them whiteys don't want us blackies, you know. And I was just absolutely gobsmacked that at that stage of our society, and we're talking 2002, 2003, I suppose, there were employers who would not have an Indigenous person in their workforce, no matter how competent and how capable they were. And that really frightened me, and it was when I linked up with Phyllis Clupp and started to do a whole lot of work with her. She's just an amazing woman, really. And so then I actually physically rang every one of the employers on the database to say I was sending out a survey about the type of people they'd want. And I deliberately sort of put into this survey a box about, you know, are you happy to have culturally different people? And I was horrified that more than half of the employers in the city didn't want anybody who wasn't white, Anglo-Saxon. And that was sort of a really interesting thing to me to see that. Running parallel to that was that I had, because of my work with Gifted and Talented, I had become very interested in world thinking. And I went to the first of 3 world thinking conferences that I went to. And the world thinking conferences run for 2 weeks, and they have, you know, heaps and heaps of cutting-edge people presenting. It was where I first met Edward de Bono, who does, you know, that world thinking and has written so many books and has done so much work in myriad thinking, and also the Howards, who were the first people who did work on multiple intelligences, and I became really fascinated with multiple intelligences and the concept that our whole education system is geared to 2 of the 7 diagnosed intelligences. And so we only actually think people are intelligent if they're good at science, or possibly literature. Maybe. Not really. If kids are really clever, it means they're good at maths and science. If they're a bit clever, it means they're good at English. If they're excellent at woodwork or getting along with people, oh no, that's not intelligent at all. And so I started running parent groups and challenging that thinking. I had some really fun times with that. You know, hands up to people whose kids are really good at science, hands up to people whose kids are really good at English, hands up to kids who's really... So the rest of you, you've all got dumb kids. Is that right? And of course, you say that to a parent, instantly their hackles, wrong, I know our kids. Well, you know, that's how our system's working. We only cater to the children who are in that small group. So the child who's interpersonally intelligent and who gets along with everybody and organises everything and has tremendous communication and personal skills, is that an intelligence or is it not an intelligence? The person who can sit in a laboratory or in a study and in actual fact devise whole new ways of doing things but doesn't get along with people, is that an intelligence? Yes, it is an intelligence. Is being able to do beautiful art and beautiful woodwork an intelligence? Well, yes, it is an intelligence. It's a kinetic intelligence, an artistic intelligence. There's musical intelligences. And they can actually measure them in the brain, and it was such an eye-opener to me that that was possible. And so I came back into the system and worked extensively with teachers trying to get them to take this on, that if you define this, and I devised a whole set of tools to work with children to define their intelligences. So kids who'd previously been put in the box of a bit dumb suddenly were 100% on this particular intelligence. And I'm saying, well, hello, you're like really highly intelligent in this area. Oh, miss, I don't think I'm highly intelligent in anything. Yes, you are. You've answered this 300 questions questionnaire and I've defined that you have a high intelligence in this area. What can you do with it? So matching those dominant intelligences to potential life patterns is really important. And so I've done a lot of work in that ever since. I've been to 3 world conferences, thinking conferences now, and they're very, very exciting things to go to because you go for an hour and listen to a new idea and then you have 5 hours to discuss it in a group. Unlike most conferences where you go for an hour and somebody talks at you and then you grab a cup of tea and then you go for another hour and somebody talks to you again and then you grab another cup of tea. You know, they're useless because you never have time to process. And as human beings, we only really take on knowledge that we've processed effectively, and the best way to do that is with other human beings, working them through, talking about it, hearing what everybody else thinks. What did you think when you heard that? And so that was just a really exciting way for me to think, which brought me up to council, where I realised that our council was really not thinking at all. It was just, I could just see that Maryborough was getting left behind. Like in the time I'd been here, the ABC used to be based here. It went off to somewhere else. All the government departments used to be based here. They went off to somewhere else. And it was because the leadership in the town hadn't moved forward. And I don't think there was any other reason for that. We needed leaders who were able to see what the future might be and to work towards that. And I made a whole lot of inquiries and I discovered other places' industrial estates were going really well, but the industrial estates in Maryborough were all sitting dead. And why was that? And I discovered that there was a number of reasons. The council had put industrial estates in that weren't connected to water, sewerage, or didn't have proper telephone cabling. So nobody was going to go into them because the first thing you had to do if you were going to do an industrial site of some sort was you had to have 100,000 litres of water if you didn't have reticulated water supply. And that was a huge expense for people to go into an industry and have to put in 100,000 litres storage of water before they could even start doing what they were going to do. Other cities were all putting in water and cabling and all the facilities that were needed, and it was one of the reasons that we were just totally being left behind. So I decided to run for council and do something about that. I guess because I did have a high profile, and I used to write letters to the paper all the time as well, highlighting things that I was concerned about. So I was a really regular writer to the Chronicle and to the Australian and to the Courier, lots of letters. And I got in and then had this amazing experience where I discovered that the council wasn't using computers in 2004 for any of their communications. And so for 4 years, a new team of people came in, and there was 5 of us came in, not as a politically affiliated bloc because we were all quite diverse, but as people who were deeply concerned about what was happening in Maryborough and with our own passions. And so there was Anne Nyer, she was really fantastic on the publicity and the marketing stuff. And there was Margaret Rowe, who was, really into the cultural and heritage stuff. There was myself, who was really into the social stuff. There was John Dortell, who had a very good eye for commerce. And so we all had a passion, but we all saw a way of moving Maryborough forward in our own particular portfolios, and we actually then organised councillors in Maryborough into portfolios rather than into divisions. We changed the whole way the system operated. And I commissioned a social development policy to be written for Maryborough, and what I felt we needed for social policy. And Anne went into a marketing policy, so each person sort of did their own thing, and it was all about making Maryborough whole. But the first thing we did was we retrofitted all our industrial blocks, because you can't get people to come and live and develop industry and be part of a city unless you do that. So in the first 2 years we retrofitted the industrial estates, and within probably 12 to 18 months after that they were almost all full. So it was a sort of a really, it was really such a basic thing, but because those people weren't thinking forward, we were really missing out. And lots of them were older people, they'd been there forever, and I think it's a security thing, and it's once more part of that Maryborough culture. Well, we know Johnny Smith, you know, he's been here forever, he's a good guy. But that's not necessarily going to take your town through to where it needs to be. You need people who can say, well, yes, what we've got's fantastic, let's use that as a base and let's move forward onto this next bit. And so in the time we were there, we started the Great Pub Crawl, one of our amazing achievements. Brings a lot of money into town, let me tell you. I then got my social policy, and I formed a community implementation group, and so once a month I met with people from all areas of town, and within 2 years we had a 70-page document with 10 key areas that we wanted to implement, and I had people in all of those areas working with me. This was a very novel experience, not just for Maryborough, but for the whole of Queensland, and suddenly I was in charge of social policy for local government Queensland. Because they'd never had anybody who'd actually written a policy and implemented it. Everybody had a policy, but it was never implemented. And that concept of actually implementing it was, whoa. And it was really exciting, because in that time we reviewed a whole lot of things that were happening that needed to change the way they happened. And I think that in the 4 years that we were in council, we moved a lot of things forward. Tragically then, of course, because the political parties had recognised that local government in the rural areas particularly had become non-politically aligned, and most councils in rural areas were in actual fact made up of a whole set of independents, and state and federal government had actually always relied on local council to be politically aligned, and certainly the Maryborough City Council used to be politically aligned in the early days that I lived here. They weren't getting their candidates being fed up, and so they said, let's amalgamate everybody, and then the areas will be so big that people will have to go back into party politics. And I believe that was the reason that it was done. I don't think there was any other logical reason, because other states had done it and they knew it hadn't worked, and they de-amalgamated again in New South Wales and Victoria, but by the time we were forced into amalgamation. But it was about, I believe, the political parties needing people being nurtured up in their particular philosophy so they could grab them to do state and federal work. And the forced amalgamation in my head was really bad. I mean, I didn't have a problem with Took, Tyro and Wooku becoming part of Maryborough, because we were quite closely aligned, and let's be honest, Wooku doesn't actually exist. And what was happening with governance out there was quite frightening. But to make Maryborough and Hervey Bay into one council, I just knew was never going to work, because I had tried to implement about 5 different programs where we would cost share across the 2 councils for the benefit of both of us, and in every case they just rejected it and said, no, we don't want to work with you. And so I was deeply concerned about the ability for that to become functional, and I just thought, my life's too short, I'm not going to run again. I don't know that it's been good. I do think that there's a real problem with the us and them mentality, and I don't know how you overcome that. And I think people in Maryborough, because they used to be the dominant group, and Hervey Bay was the little coastal community, they don't cope with Hervey Bay's now the dominant group, and we're the sort of satellite. And I think that that's very destructive in lots of ways, because people don't see what's really happening, and you'll hear people on the street all the time saying, oh, they're not doing anything for Maryborough. But that's a factor of the age of the city. So I know when we realised that the plumbing in the centre of the CBD was completely cactus, and all the businesses in the CBD, whenever it rained, the sewerage just came up through their toilets into their business premises, and we bit the bullet and said that we would replace all that plumbing. But, you know, it was $19 million and you can't see it. So it's really difficult because people want new stuff. You know, they want new civic centres and new libraries and new everything. They don't want to know that you're spending $20 million of the ratepayers' money on pipes that are underground that are just carrying sewage. Why would you do that? But if you don't do it, of course, it all falls to pieces. And I think part of the us-them mentality in Maryborough and Hervey Bay is that much of the money that has to be spent in Maryborough is unseen money because it's replacing aged infrastructure, because we were the first town to be sewered. We were one of the first towns to have electric light in Queensland. And that infrastructure is all old. And the way streets were put in, we didn't put in streets with curbing and guttering, and you've got to redo them. Whereas in Hervey Bay, because it was a new town and they didn't have that aged infrastructure, they put in new stuff. And so it's really tricky, that balance. And I think we won't ever be successful until we actually suddenly say, we are a community. We can't de-amalgamate, it just doesn't work at this point in time. We are a community, and this is that part of it, and this is this part of it. And it's a bit like the multiple intelligences. Just because this group are doing it this way and this group are doing it this way, neither of them are wrong, they're just different. And we have to accept those things for their differences, which I think we still haven't got a lot of, because it's not just from Maryborough, it also comes from Hervey Bay. You know, the Hervey Bay are very derogatory about things that happen in Maryborough and vice versa. And I think, I don't know whether we'll ever move forward into a stage where people see us as a whole community to work together. And my legacy is that I think in lots of ways I've innovated programs. So I've taught people to communicate effectively. I've taught people to look at things from a whole lot of perspectives and challenged prejudice. As a councillor elected in Maryborough, I think my legacy was that we developed social policy and became much more socially aware, and that we got an effective housing group now for public housing, and we've got a number of facilities, including the showgrounds, which operate much more effectively than they used to. And as a person that I believe, well, I know that I've been able to go into people's lives oftentimes and save them from destruction or explosion. And I have people who say to me, you know, when you came and sat us down and talked with us and worked with us for days, weeks, months, you saved our lives. You know, I've so many parents who've said to me, you know, we wouldn't have a child now were it not for them. And I guess that's my legacy, that I believe we need to value every person and see whether we can make them into whatever they can become in their wholeness. So as I look back over my life of 70 plus years now, I see that most important job I've ever done was raise my children. I have to say, I have three very lovely, responsible children who are active members in their community, carrying on the work that I do, I guess, and have very strong social consciences and are deep thinkers. And my son-in-law says, you know, Family Feud, if Family Feud was about giving a family a topic and then they have to discuss it, and the people who can discuss it for the longest win, your family would be carryover champions for 1,000 years. Because we'll sit around and talk, and I think that's a really important thing, and it's one of the things that concerns me, that families don't communicate effectively anymore. People don't sit around a table and discuss and have a meal together. So I believe communication is critical to the ongoing health of our society. And Albert Einstein in 1954 said, when technology takes over from human interaction, the world is doomed. And I think that's a really powerful statement. I think we have to always believe in the good in people, and I believe that 99.7% of people are good and want to do the right thing. Nobody goes out to say, I'm going to do bad things. Bad things just sort of sometimes happen. And I believe that we have to learn gratitude and compassion, and I think we have to start teaching that to our children. So with my grandchildren, whenever I'm with them at night, the last thing we do is, what's something that happened today that you're grateful for? And when we first started, they couldn't do it. Well, nothing's happened today that I'm grateful for. Well, did you have breakfast this morning? Yeah. Does every child in Australia and the world have breakfast? No, I don't suppose so. So are you grateful that every day you've got breakfast? Oh, yeah, I suppose so. And what's something you're sorry for? Because we've also reached a stage where nobody wants to accept responsibility for their actions. We'll find somebody that we can sue or blame, but we all do things every day that maybe we shouldn't, or we don't do things that we should. So it makes them think about that. And who in our world, or your world, do you need to pray for? In my case, because I'm a deeply committed Christian, but for other people, who do you just want to have positive thoughts for that you know about or have met today? So to make them think outside of themselves and to view what the bigger world is rather than just their own being. And I think if we could all do that each day and be grateful and thankful for what we've got, because particularly here in Australia, as Billy Connolly says, you're born in Australia, I already won the lottery, and it's so true. And I think unless we teach our future generations to be compassionate, to be grateful, to be outward looking and thinking, we are doomed, which really concerns me, I have to say. So that's where I'm at 70. And my philosophy for life, which is laughter lubricates learning.